Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I go for a walk and deliver an episode before I get home. I'm Brendan Riley. Greetings, listeners, from the beginning of June. You're hearing this in middle of June, so I'm about a week ahead, generally, in my recording. As I mentioned in the last episode, I am no longer walking my kids to school, and I'm working from home for the summer, so I've had to pick a new schedule for doing my walk, and I think what I'm going to do is each morning before breakfast, I'll take a short walk and do some recording for you on days when I feel like I have something to say. So I had two choices for today. I think I'm going to put off the Kickstarter discussion for a day. I like kind of doing those every other episode. In case you're not all that interested in Kickstarter, it's kind of lame for me to spend like 2 weeks on it or something. So I'm going to alternate that with other episodes. And I want to talk about something that popped up for me today, and I'm not really sure how to characterize it. So I'm going to explain what I found or what I'm thinking about, and I'll let you think about how to discuss this. So it starts with a moment in a recent episode of The Dice Tower. It was one of the Suzanne and Mandy episodes. This is the podcast. And Suzanne talked about a new game she had played in prototype form, I think it was called Prowler's Passage, which I think is a terrible name. But in it, again, she's describing a game she played. I'm describing my recollection of her description. But here's the key part I noticed. In it, she talks about how you collect some resource that varies by color or something. And then you also are, in the course of the game, fighting for control of these, I think she said pillars, that are also designated with that color. And the way the game works, the way the scoring works, is if you have control of the pillar when scoring happens, then you get to score the colors, the resources of that color that you have. And if you don't have control of that resource, then you don't get to score that color at all. It's just worth nothing. And I thought that sounded really interesting, and it reminded me of another game I'd played recently. A couple weeks ago, I got a chance to play World's Fair 1893 with a pal of mine, and that game also has a similar thing. In that game, there are 5, I think, areas where cards are played, and you take control of an area by putting one of your cubes on it, or you get to make a move in the area by putting a cube on it. Then you collect the cards that were there. And some of the cards correspond to some of the areas, although they're not dealt out in that particular way. So you could put a cube on the yellow area and then pick up cards that go with the blue area. And then at the end of the round, which is relatively short, I think you get 3 or 4 turns per round generally. It varies, but that's basically. And then during scoring, there's a couple different things, but one of the big things in scoring is whoever has control of one of those colored areas gets a scoring token for each of the cards they have in that area that they had control of. So if you have control of the yellow by having the most, then any yellow cards that you have, you get a scoring marker for it. And at the end of the game, you score by having a variety of colors of scoring markers. So you're constantly trying to have control in different rounds of different areas so that at the end of the game you have the widest variety of these markers. So that description of Prowler's Passage and World's Fair 1893, those were resonating in my head. And then Suzanne mentioned that the designer of Prowler's Passage was J. Alex Kevern, who is also the designer of World's Fair 1893. And that got me thinking, wait a second, I think I've played another game that he designed, and that's Sentient, which is a game that came out last year around Origins time, and I actually picked up at Origins. It was very fun. And in that game, you also have this dual mix of getting control of cards and getting control of, in that game, it's investor tokens that are from corresponding categories, and scoring based on how well you manage to match those up. In Sentient, it's you multiply the number of investor tokens in a category by the number of cards in that category to get your score. So if you have 2 cards and 2 tokens, you get 4 points. If you have 3 cards and 2 tokens, you get 6. If you have 0 tokens from a category, you don't get any points for any of those cards that you have. So obviously there's something. So what resonated with me at first was this kind of accidental observation that, hey, Prowler's Passage sounds a lot like World's Fair that I just played, and then realizing that in fact it also sounded kind of, the scoring mechanism sounded like it was from the same family of scoring that you'd get with something like Sentient. So all of this got me thinking about the idea of designers using the same thing or exploring the same idea over and over again. And it got me thinking a little bit about sort of creativity, got me thinking about the way that art is made and evolves, the way that an artist grows or matures. Because this is something that we see there's a lot of designers who have this kind of thing. Mac Gertz is fairly well known for his hand management, hand control games, right? Concordia and Transatlantic are talked about as kind of games that are similar. Or if you look at Uwe Rosenberg, who has produced a lot of games, I'll say, but Agricola, Caverna, Le Havre, and A Feast for Odin all feel very similar in terms of you're playing workers and getting resources, and you're trying to manage workers and resources. And then, of course, he's also been playing with those tetrominoes with games like Patchwork and Indian Summer, and Spring Meadow is the new one. There's one more in there, Cottage Garden. And all of those are playing with the tetrominoes, which of course he also put into A Feast for Odin. And I haven't seen Nussford yet, so I don't know how that compares to these other ones. It's interesting to me, this idea of designers who keep returning to a particular thing. And so I like to think about whether, like when Alex Kevern sits down to design a new game, does he say, I really like, what is it about that particular scoring mechanism that he likes so much? Why does he choose to go back to that well again, but explore it in a different way, right? Like each of those 3 games I described, Sentient and World's Fair and Prowler's Passage, they each wrestle with this kind of scoring mechanism in just a slightly distinct way. They tweak it, and in doing so, I think they allow him to explore nuances of the idea that he just hadn't gotten to play with yet. Rosenberg, you could kind of say the same thing with his games like Caverna or Agricola or that new one. So it's interesting to me to see designers who do that sort of thing, where they're going to go back to, or they kind of return to these ideas and wrestle with them anew, versus designers who really strive to differentiate the thing that they've made from the previous thing that they made. A couple designers I thought of as I was talking about that would be somebody like Vlada Chvátil or Richard Garfield. Now, you know, and I actually didn't talk about the third person I was thinking of who kind of shows this return to an idea would be Martin Wallace. As much as I like Martin Wallace, and he does a variety of different things. You know, you could point to Munga Invaders and Onward to Venus and Via Nebula is all feeling very different. You can also say like Via Nebula is a train game again, just in a slightly different form. Or you could look at A Few Acres of Snow, A Study in Emerald, Mythotopia, and A Handful of Stars as all games about deck building, sort of light deck building with area control using cards, where when you get control of the area, you get to have that card. He sort of is returning to this idea. And then he recently re-released Lincoln, which I understand has some of those same mechanisms as well. So the question then for the player is, what do you get from engaging with a design that returns to this kind of this experimentation again? And I feel like for me it's similar to liking to a new album from a band, right? If there's a band I like, say Flogging Molly, I don't think they've released an album in a while, but we can put that there, and I listen to one of their albums, it's generally going to be similar to one of their previous albums. They're not usually all that different, but they do evolve as they go over time, and each album has its own nuances and pleasantries that I find fun. And I think the same can be said about a designer's oeuvre, where they may be producing games that are in the same realm as the previous games they made, but that doesn't mean that they're not intriguing. At the same time, like I said, we do have designers who seem to actively work against or work expansively. Like, so you look at somebody like Vlada Chvátil. You know, his games are so broadly diverse in terms of what they do. The other person I can think of that feels that way to me is Richard Garfield. You know, I actually have recorded my Great Designers episode of Richard Garfield, but I haven't published it yet. It's sort of in the can for a week when I get behind on my schedule or whatever. But the long and short of it is, between Magic the Gathering, Vampire the Eternal Struggle, and Netrunner, which became Android Netrunner, Bunny Kingdom, Robo Rally, and King of Tokyo, Garfield has a really wide variety of kinds of games that he's made, and they explore different ways of having players interact with one another and different kinds of central mechanisms that don't feel like it's the same game over and over again. Even in the space of those first 3 collectible games I described, all 3 of those try to do something drastically different, right? Like Magic is this one-on-one duel. Vampire the Eternal Struggle is a multiplayer game where it's meant to be played more than 2 people, although you can just play 2. And Netrunner's 2 again, but it's wildly asymmetrical, right? The different players are doing different things to try to win the game, and it feels drastically different as you play. So Garfield is somebody who seems to be pursuing a variety of different avenues in ways that I'm not sure I see this happening in a lot of other art forms. If you think about like a musician, I guess there are some people who do it. You could probably point to Sting as somebody who's done this, or maybe Paul Simon. Although, I mean, people whose music comes out in wildly different genres, that doesn't seem like a thing. I don't know. I guess painters go through that some. I'm certainly not much of a painter, so it's hard for me to say. Filmmakers maybe are the next level up. You could probably line up Spielberg's movies, and you could say, look, he's done comedy, he's done horror, he's done thrillers, he's done historical dramas, he's done... So maybe somebody like Spielberg would be a Chvátil type, where they're creating art that fits into these broadly differentiated categories, as opposed to an artist who is going back and doing the same thing over and over again. You know, you have somebody like, I don't know, Wes Craven, who keeps making horror films, and they're all interesting and good, but they're all in the same ballpark. And I think that's a crucial part of trying to understand what artists are doing. So I'm not sure that I really had anything to say here, except that this, for me, discovering this synergy in J. Alex Kevern's games of this scoring type really got me thinking a bit more about the relationship of the designer as creative artist to games, as opposed to, I don't know, experimenter with rules. And of course, there are lots of other designers who do this as well. You could point to Rob Daviau's Legacy games as a as iteration on a theme, as experimenting with this idea of a game that's told in narrative form. You could probably look to Stuffed Fables as an iteration on the children's adventure game from Jerry Hawthorne, or Ryan Lockett's adventure games maybe also seem to be exploring this. So it's not like this is all that unique an observation, but to me it resonates specifically because mechanisms feel like a thing that's so uniquely board games. I mean, it isn't really, but like when I think about a mechanism in a board game, to me that is more akin to a musical technique or a painting style than it is to the narrative subject matter, perhaps. And so seeing people do variations on this mechanism strikes me as a kind of artistic creativity that I hadn't really observed before. So, today was one of the more pointless days of the podcast, I guess, but it's interesting to me as I get more into the hobby to think about what do people do as they're growing as designers. And it's interesting for me as a designer who works relatively slowly, and my design partner who works like a machine gun, shooting games out like crazy, to see how those experiments go, or how that experimentation works. As we toy with a variety of different mechanisms or gameplay experiences, it's interesting to me to to sort of ruminate on what is it that makes a game particularly fun, or what is it the thing that you're trying to achieve with a moment in a game, and sort of see how, as a designer, recognizing your own proclivity toward one thing or another allows you to grow in the games you're making, or recognize where you're choosing to revisit ground you've already walked over. So I'd be interested to know, for those of you who have dabbled in design or are designers, what are the things you find yourself returning to? What are the gameplay experiences that capture your imagination and make you want to do more than one game exploring that idea? Or what's a game design where you finished the game and then you said, I think I need to take another run at this particular element to try to explore it in a different way, or find a different experience with the game design. For those of you who aren't game designers, I'm curious, have you had this moment? Have you had moments where you say, oh, I see this thing that this artist is doing? Could be game design, could be other ways, but a place where you find a thread through an artist's work that helps you feel like you can understand them a little better, or get a sense of what's going on in that art. It could be films, it could be music, or of course, given our subject matter, it could be board games. Drop in the Board Game Geek Guild 3269 and let me know what you think. What are your designers? What are they exploring, and so on. You could drop me a line, Brendan at rattleboxgames.com, or on Twitter, I'm at rattleboxgames. And I look forward to hearing from you and seeing what designs are fascinating you lately. Otherwise, thanks for joining me. Hopefully these summer sessions will be productive, and the morning construction sounds were more interesting or different than the afternoon commuting sounds. So, thanks for joining me. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.